Good morning, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. I can see the participant numbers just climbing up. We'll probably give it 30 seconds or so just to let people join the room and let's see the attendee numbers plateau out, and then we'll begin. Numbers appear to be stabilizing a little bit, so shall we begin? So thank you everybody for joining us for this pension update and planning opportunities webinar. As you can see there, I'm joined by my colleague Laura Salter, who is a financial planning director in Birmingham, and I am Nick Nesbitt, a financial planning partner based in our Manchester office. Just to start with a bit of digital housekeeping, we will be recording today's session, and the aim will be to circulate that around all attendees and those who registered in the next couple of days, potentially this afternoon. In terms of questions, there's no ability to ask a question sort of live, but if you put any questions or comments that you have in the chat, we have got some time towards the end of the session to address those and give answers. And ultimately, if there's any questions we aren't able to get to on the live session today, then we will endeavour to get back to everybody individually to answer those questions. Equally, a lot of you will already have a point of contact at Mazar Private Clients, so if there's anything particular that you want to discuss, then naturally please feel free to contact that person. Other than that, I think that we can dive into today's topics. So, pensions. I guess we started the calendar year of 2023 not particularly expecting a huge amount of change to pensions, but we've probably come to expect the unexpected when it comes to pension rule changes. So, for those of you who joined the webinar at the end of March, you'll be aware that the spring budget brought about a lot of changes that were very much a surprise, if not slightly leaked beforehand, but certainly we weren't expecting them when we came into 2023. And a lot of those changes are now in force from a legislation perspective, and we're planning with our clients based on those new rules. However, over the sort of summer break, while we were all trying to enjoy our holiday, there was a new set of rules that sort of slipped out and haven't really made their way into the press. They are still in draft form, but they do have some fairly significant impacts, especially around lump sum rules and death benefits. And that's really what we're here to do today. We're here to reconfirm some of the changes that we've seen in the last 6 months and specifically look at those changes that came in over the summer. And as I've said, I think they are, they're quite subtle, they are quite significant changes for people's planning. So our intention is to make this a 3-webinar series between now and the end of the tax year to confirm the changes that we're still waiting for the exact detail on, and then highlight the planning that we feel clients should be considering both in the current 23-24 tax year, but then moving into 24-25. Because I think safe to say that anybody with significant pension benefits needs to pay attention to these changes and just have a little look at their pension planning. So I think the intention for today's session is just to lay some foundations around these various areas you can see on the screen now. So Laura will pick up on the annual allowance changes, which are very much now in force. We'll then have a look at the lifetime allowance changes, which are gradually moving into force with a bit of a halfway house currently in place for the current tax year. Then we've got the big new bit of information, which is the death benefit changes, which is very much in draft, and there's lots of questions that remain unanswered on that front. And then lastly, we'll double back to give you the sort of house view, the Mazar house view, and as I said earlier, have an opportunity for questions and answers. So without further ado, let me pass over to Laura for a bit of a recap on the annual allowance.
Thanks, Nick, and good morning, everyone. As Nick said, the first place we're going to start is the annual allowance, which is, in essence, how much can go into a pension each tax year. The reason we're covering this as part of the webinar is because pension contributions are one of the big drivers of total value, which is what the lifetime allowance is concerned with. So, as a recap, every individual has an annual allowance each tax year, which, if you're making personal contributions, is the lower of 100% of your UK relevant earnings, or the annual allowance, which is in its standard form. If you've got no earnings, that's actually reduced to 3,600. So the key change about 6 months ago was that the annual allowance is now 60,000, which is up from £40,000 last year. We still have the ability to carry forward any unused allowances from the previous 3 tax years. The tapered annual allowance, which is where it's reduced for high earners, is still in force. Now, it's been that way, it's been a taper since 2016. It's been changed multiple times since then. It's kept us on our toes. And the tapering rules again changed from the 6th of April 2023. And that's what I'll cover in the subsequent slides. So the old rules, so prior to the 6th of April this year, the annual allowance was 40,000, and you had the ability to look back over 3 previous tax years and carry forward any unused allowances. The tapering for high earners was subject to certain tests, the threshold and adjusted income test. And the adjusted income test is the key, because once total income exceeded 240,000, and when you're in that space between 240,000 to 312,000, you started to lose £1 of your standard annual allowance for every £2 of adjusted income that you had over that threshold of 240,000. So that was on a sliding scale up to 312,000, at which point you'd be subject to the minimum tapered annual allowance, which was £4,000 at the time, which is quite a significant reduction from the standard annual allowance of 40,000. What we also had in play at the same time is the money purchase annual allowance, which is what an individual is subject to if they've accessed pension funds flexibly to take a taxable income. This was a question, I received this question quite a lot about whether individuals are subject to the money purchase annual allowance if they've only taken tax-free cash. And the crucial thing is no, they're not. So it's only if a taxable income is taken flexibly from a pension. Prior to the 6th of April this year, the money purchase annual allowance was £4,000, so very similar to the minimum taper. We then reached the 6th of April and we had some new rules. So the key one is that the annual allowance has now increased to £60,000 per annum. So it gives significant scope for additional contributions for those that are in the position to be able to do so. We still have the 3-year rule around carry forward allowances. The tapering for high earners has been eased. So we've still got the threshold and adjusted income tests, but the adjusted income threshold has now been increased to 260,000. The rate at which it tapers has stayed the same. So for every £2 of income above that threshold, you lose £1 of your annual allowance. But crucially, that minimum taper has been increased from £4,000 to £10,000. So the scope, even if you are subject to that taper, is there now for increased contributions. And in a similar vein, the money purchase annual allowance tracks the tapered annual allowance, and that's been increased to £10,000 per annum, which is a significant increase for individuals that fit in that space. That was a quick recap of the annual allowance, because I know the main bulk of the webinar will be on the lifetime allowance, and Nick's going to cover the changes.
Thanks, Laura. Yeah, as Laura said, we're now just going to recap on something that's debatably now a bit of a dinosaur, but technically still in place for this tax year. So worthwhile just covering it. So the lifetime allowance is as Laura said, it's a limit on the maximum amount of value you can build up within pensions tax efficiently within your lifetime. Ultimately, you can go over the lifetime allowance, but it's just a case that tax charges will start to be applied on funds that are deemed to be in excess of the lifetime allowance. And as you can see, the rates of tax that apply when people have been in excess of the lifetime allowance have been fairly punitive. So it's essentially two rates depending on how you choose to access those benefits that are over the lifetime allowance. One being 25%, the other being 55%. But the broad view is that if you're getting into that position where you're suffering those rates of tax, then you're sort of undoing some of the good of the original pension contributions and the tax relief that you will have got on the way in. So generally, our advice has been to try to avoid lifetime allowance tax charges where possible. However, the Chancellor somewhat helped us out from that perspective in March by dropping a bit of a surprise, which was the plan to completely remove the lifetime allowance. As I've sort of alluded to earlier, they've done that in a bit of a two-stage process because of the need to pass the relevant legislation. So essentially, the lifetime allowance does still exist as a concept currently, and the associated tests that we've always seen when people have entered retirement are still there. However, they've just removed the teeth of the beast, if you will, by just putting the tax charge to 0%. So where somebody might have suffered that 25 or 55% tax rate previously, there is still technically a tax charge, but it's just at 0%. And for those with basic math skills on the call will know that a 0% tax rate creates a nil tax charge. So essentially, nobody should be suffering lifetime allowance tax charges in the current 23-24 tax year. Looking forward to the 6th of April, 2024, so the next tax year, the plan, and we see no reason now why this won't go ahead, is that the lifetime allowance as a legislative instrument will be fully removed, and it won't exist anymore. So people won't have to worry about being in excess of the lifetime allowance or their pension funds growing in excess of the lifetime allowance, because there just will not be that assessment and those tax charges that are set out higher up on the slide. However, as soon as we sort of started to digest the removal of the lifetime allowance, it did pose a few questions, because lots of bits of pension legislation are pegged or have been pegged to the lifetime allowance. And a key one there is tax-free cash. So sure most people on the call will be aware that when you come to access your pension benefits, typically 25% of what you've got is available tax-free, and the rest will be taxable at your marginal rate. And that limit was always 20. The maximum tax-free cash you could have was 25% of the available lifetime allowance. So either the 1.073 million figure or a protected lifetime allowance that you had that might have been higher than that level. So with the removal of the lifetime allowance, there was all of a sudden the question as to what would be the limit on tax-free cash. Would it be 25% of whatever you've got, or would it be a new arbitrary figure? And I think we all feared that, and I'll come on to that in a second. And it's somewhere in between, really. It's just 25% of the outgoing lifetime allowance. So effectively, that level, while still not there, the 1.073 million, still has a legacy in driving the amount of tax-free cash that people can have. The last point around the history of the lifetime allowance is something called transitional protection. And this was basically a series of bits of legislation that were put in place to protect people, when the lifetime allowance was introduced back in 2006, and then each time that they reduced the lifetime allowance subsequently. So people on the call may have heard of or may have enhanced protection, individual protection, fixed protection, or primary protection. And they all gave certain, as the word suggests, protections against reduced lifetime allowance. It gave people their own personalised lifetime allowance position. And if we just move on to the next slide, John, I think this slide covers a lot of what I just talked about. Probably the one point I'll pick up on here was the way that the lifetime allowance was structured made it very important for us to consider how people access their pensions. So if somebody had, say, a final salary pension and a defined contribution or a fund, as we'd call it, it was quite important when all the lifetime allowance legislation was in play that you ordered those pensions appropriately, so that if one of them was to suffer a lifetime allowance tax charge, it was the most appropriate one. And typically that led to people taking their defined benefit pensions first, because they were typically the most valuable, and you didn't want them to be eroded by suffering a lifetime allowance tax charge. And I raise this because one view is that the changes to the rules will impact on how you might access your various pension benefits. So if we just come on to the new rules, as we've this is for the 23-24 tax year, as I've set out already, the crucial point is there's no tax charge this year. So that means that if you were to access your pension benefits and go over the lifetime allowance in the current tax year, there would be no tax to pay, and that will create some opportunities for people. So we've got a number of clients who historically will have breached the lifetime allowance, and they will have taken their maximum available tax-free cash, but they will have left an amount of the pension fund, what's called uncrystallised, so untouched. And what they were doing there was basically avoiding having the test against the lifetime allowance. And I think Laura and me and other colleagues would have sort of talked flippantly about, oh, well, if the lifetime allowance ever gets removed, then actually that might work in your favour. And hey presto, that's exactly what happened. So for those people who've got those lifetime allowance excess funds, so it might be, I've got a client with quite a lot of sort of over £1 million of excess lifetime allowance funds. We previously thought that was just going to have to suffer a 25% tax charge at some point in time, but we were just putting off the day when that would happen. Now, that seemingly that £250,000 in that example, it is back in the client's pocket effectively. So one thing we're thinking about, and I'll underscore thinking, is what's called, or what's being termed, phantom crystallizations of those excess funds. Because as we see it, there is potentially an opportunity in this tax year, while the lifetime allowance still exists, but has no teeth, going back to my earlier analogy, to pass those benefits through a lifetime allowance test, make sure that they are crystallized in the eyes of HMRC, so that if legislation is ever reversed, and we'll finish on that in a second, that actually those benefits that were previously staring down the barrel of a 25% tax charge actually could well have gone beyond that lifetime allowance test without any tax. So that's a key planning point for the remainder of this year, is should people be considering phantom crystallizations. Then we come on to talk about the historic LTA protections, because I guess my gut reaction when I heard about this was surely they're all worthless now. If there's going to be no lifetime allowance, then what value could lifetime allowance protection have? But actually the rules that come out over the summer have brought in, yes, some new death benefit rules, which Laura will cover next, but also some new lump sum rules. So I mentioned earlier that the lump sum will continue to be 25% of the old LTA value, or your personal LTA from having an LTA protection. So if, for example, you have fixed protection 2016, trying to remember, then that was 1.25 million, and ultimately you could have £312,500 of tax-free cash, as opposed to the sort of standard 268,000 new lump sum allowance. So those historic lifetime allowance protections will still have some value, and people should continue to be aware of those and keep them on file. It's also really important to note that one of the key conditions for a lot of those previous protections was that you had to stop contributing. So HMRC were happy to give you some protections, but they didn't want you to be able to continue to contribute, which is understandable. But what the what the new rules have said, and this is now has received royal assent and is in legislation, is those people who have protections, as long as the contribution occurs after the 6th of April 2023, then they can make contributions without fear of losing that protection. And I guess that's important from the perspective of those lump sum allowances I talked about, but also in case of legislative rowback and needing to rely on that legislation in the future. So the last point I think I've already covered, covered half of it, in that I think we're going to, over the course of the next 6 to 12 months, be reassessing the order in which people take benefits and taking their defined benefit and their defined contribution pots. And crucially, actually, for some people who previously had used all of their lifetime allowance, but still had some pension funds that were in excess of the lifetime allowance, they couldn't access any tax-free cash from those funds. But we believe now that those people could well be able to do that and could have another dollop of tax-free cash available to them. I think that'd be particularly relevant for people who've taken big defined benefit pensions, so doctors and civil servants and so on and so forth. So if we just now finish with the rules for next year, as I've said already, we expect the lifetime allowance to disappear as a concept. The existing protections will still have some value, and they've also set out that there will be some opportunity to continue to apply for protections. I think this will be very niche, but I think for people who've got large pension benefits and don't have existing protection, then it's something definitely just to have a quick look at. And I think I've covered the point around the lump sum allowance and it creating some new opportunities and some new planning routes around taking tax-free cash. So just to finish on a bit of a political point, but I'll try and avoid any political views or anything of that nature. So there's a slide in a second which demonstrates this, but this was, I think it was fair to say this was a fairly conservative policy introduced by a conservative government. It naturally looks after people who have fairly significant pension benefits. And naturally, Labour came out and immediately criticised it and suggested that if they get into power over the next, 14, 15 months, then they would reverse this abolition of the lifetime allowance. So in the early days of this legislation, we were quite careful around the risks of legislative reversal. Now, the narrative from Labour seems to have softened a little bit in recent months, and I think the way that the legislation has been rolled out and the death benefit rules are maybe more palatable from a Labour perspective. But it's still something we need to be mindful of when we're planning with our clients. Are we taking any steps that could leave a client heavily exposed if things were to be reversed? So ultimately, we plan on the basis of what we have today and the rules we have today. But I think you've just got to have an eye towards the what ifs. And then lastly, just a slide to indicate the point of it being a very conservative piece of legislation, and naturally those within Parliament have an element of gamification to them. But here you can just see in pretty plain terms that Labour weren't particularly in favour of this abolition of the lifetime allowance, and therefore you have to question what might come if they obtain power over the next 15 months or so. So now back to Laura for the unenviable task of trying to explain the as yet to be determined but quite interesting death benefit rules. So over to you, Laura.
Thanks, Nick. That's quite an accurate introduction to what I'm going to try and do now. We'll go through slowly, but there is the chance at the end to ask questions if you want to seek clarification on any point. I think I will start with a big note of caution that we ourselves as an industry are still seeking clarity on the scope of these changes, exactly how they will be implemented by pension providers, and how they will apply in certain specific situations. So what I say today is our understanding at the moment. We will, of course, keep you updated as a firm through our successive webinars as this evolves. What I will also say as well at this point is when I'm talking about death benefits in this section, I am talking about death benefits for defined contribution schemes. Death benefits for defined benefit schemes, slightly outside of the scope of this webinar, but again, we can provide further details with your individual financial planners and on future webinars. So if we go on to the next slide, please, Jordan, thank you. I think we'll start with a common misconception. So as pension legislation has changed over these years, what we've become used to is seeing the phrase of pensions are efficient from an IHT perspective, from an inheritance tax perspective. And my answer to this all the time is they can be if they are in the appropriate place. So if a pension has an expression of wishes or the scheme allows nomination of beneficiaries, if trustees retain discretion over who receives the benefits available, and if a master trust is in place for the pension scheme, then they are usually free from inheritance tax. However, they could be subject to inheritance tax if there aren't nominations available, if any decisions made by the plan holder, by the individual that owns the pension scheme, if they're binding on the pension scheme itself, if there are transfers into the scheme within 2 to 7 years of that individual's death, and any benefits that are paid within a guaranteed period if you've purchased an annuity, which is that guaranteed income for life. So pensions can be efficient from an inheritance tax perspective, but as you can see from what I've outlined, it's very scheme specific. So it's really important that for any scheme, these death benefits are checked and that you seek guidance if you're unsure over what those death benefits actually mean from an inheritance tax perspective. This has been a real issue for me over this last week or so. I met a client, and unfortunately that individual passed away relatively early on in our relationship. So some of his pension schemes we hadn't yet taken a decision on the best thing to do. And one of those schemes unfortunately fell into that right-hand column. So because we're using the spousal exemption, everything's passing to his spouse, there is no inheritance tax due on that pension lump sum that his spouse will receive, but it is now inside her estate from an inheritance tax perspective. So it is really important that we always understand death benefits on pension schemes and that we take appropriate action as quickly as possible. So if we go on to the next slide. Thank you. I think to start with, what we'll just cover is the forms of death benefits that are available on defined contribution pension funds. So they tend to fall into 3 broad categories. The first one on the left is a lump sum payment. Exactly as it sounds, the beneficiary of that pension fund would receive a lump sum out of the pension. It is removed from that pension wrapper, so it is no longer a pension, and it can be paid directly to a person or into a trust structure. Now, there are a number of reasons that you may want to use a trust structure. Again, it's very bespoke, and there are then further tax consequences of using a trust structure. So we'd always want to work with an individual to check that it's absolutely appropriate for their circumstances. But taking a lump sum removes the funds from the pension, and it is then a lump sum to continue as the beneficiary wishes. The second option is a dependent or nominees drawdown pension. So in the same way that an individual, whilst they're alive, has the ability to draw down from their scheme, this provides the beneficiary with the ability to also do so. The key differential is that this allows the funds to stay within that pension wrapper, so that protection from income tax, capital gains tax, and potentially inheritance tax is a key benefit in the option to elect for a drawdown pension instead. And then the third option is a dependent or nominees annuity, which is where the entire fund is used to purchase a guaranteed income for life. Given the changes that we've seen to the economic environment over the last 18 months, annuity rates have increased significantly from previous historic lows. So annuities are becoming an increasingly important part of any discussion that we're having with clients at the moment. And most, I say most because not all, pensions will provide a dependent or nominee to benefit from an annuity if that's what they choose to do with the funds. The key disclaimer at the bottom, and this is what we're going to move on to, is it is the age at which that original pension holder dies that dictates how the funds will be taxed in the hands of the beneficiary. And that's been the key change that we've seen emerge over the summer. So this table just allows us to explain and indicate current position and then the proposed changes from the 6th of April going forwards. So if this individual passed away prior to age 75, the current rules apply, so the 23-24 tax year. So if we take the left-hand column, the lump sum, should the beneficiary elect for a lump sum, because the individual passed away under age 75, that lump sum is tax-free in the hands of the beneficiary. So if the individual passed away with £100,000 within their pension and the beneficiary elected for a lump sum, they would receive £100,000 to them with no income tax consequences. The downside to that, which is why it's in red, is that you have withdrawn those funds from that protected pension environment. So any subsequent growth on those funds is taxable, depending on what's done with it. And it's also within the beneficiary's estate from an inheritance tax perspective. The proposed changes to any lump sum death benefits are detailed below. So the funds would still be tax-free under the proposed changes in the hands of the beneficiary if they elect for a lump sum, and they would still be taxable for any ongoing growth and with inside their estate from an inheritance tax perspective. So with a lump sum election, actually there are no significant changes with the proposed changes to the legislation. The key potential change is if we look to that second column, which is where the individual's elected to keep the funds within the pension wrapper. So under current rules, let's keep using that £100,000 example because it's a nice round number for us. If they've elected to keep that £100,000 within the pension, under current rules, they can draw that £100,000 out as they wish, whether that's 2 lots of 50,000, whether that's 10 lots of 10,000, and it would still be tax-free in the hands of their beneficiaries. The pros of doing that, the benefits of doing that, is that the funds grow free of income tax, capital gains tax, and they sit outside of the estate for inheritance tax. But the proposed changes, and this is where Nick alluded to them being subtle but quite powerful, is that from the 6th of April, potentially that £100,000 that sits within the pension, when it's drawn from the pension, so whether that's £50,000 lump sum, 5,000 or 10,000, would now be taxable in the hands of the beneficiary. So it'd sit on top of any other earned or pension income that that beneficiary has and taxed at their marginal rate. The funds that stay within the pension still benefit from tax-free growth and are outside of the estate for inheritance tax. But instead of having that pot available for tax-free flexible withdrawals, they are still flexible, but they are potentially now taxable as well. So that's the really significant potential change that we are going to see from the 6th of April next year. If we then move on to the final column, the annuity purchase, which is where you purchase the guaranteed income for life. Under the current rules, again, that annuity payment that you receive each month would be tax-free in the hands of the beneficiaries. And from an inheritance tax perspective, that pot doesn't have a value anymore because you've used it to purchase that guaranteed income. So there's no growth implications and there's no asset value implications usually on the beneficiary and receiving that. Proposed changes again from the 6th of April. The key change is that annuity income in the hands of the beneficiary would then potentially be subject to income tax. So again, would sit on top of any other earned or pension income that they have and be taxed at their highest marginal rate. Again, there's no growth of that pot to consider because it's been used to purchase the guaranteed income, and there's no asset value to consider when we're talking about inheritance tax. So the key changes here with the proposed changes are that potential for what was previously tax-free income in the hands of the beneficiary to become taxable in the hands of the beneficiary. We'll summarise with our house view at the end, but what it's meaning for advisors like myself and Nick is that we are now returning with quite careful consideration to beneficiary nominations and considering what the options are for all of our clients. Just get Jordan to go on to the next slide. Thank you. So we talked about what would happen pre-age 75. I'm now just going to quickly summarise what would happen should an individual pass away post-age 75, which, going back to Nick's part of the presentation, age 75 is a key age because it's that date of the final lifetime allowance test under current legislation. So again, we'll start with the left-hand column. Under current rules, current legislation, if an individual opts for the lump sum, that entire lump sum is currently taxable to income tax in the hands of the beneficiary. So we'll use that £100,000 worth of pension funds. Should they choose to receive those pension funds all in one go, that is effectively £100,000 of taxable income in their hands. So it would sit on top of any other income that they have and be subject to their highest marginal rate of tax. And that can quite quickly escalate you through basic, higher and additional rates of tax depending on other income, and crucially have some implications on personal allowances as well. Again, the downside is that any growth on that funds on the net funds is taxable and they're inside the estate for beneficiaries. From the 6th of April next year, there is no change to that. The funds are largely likely, or still be likely to be taxable in the hands of the beneficiary. We take the beneficiary pension. Under current rules, any taxable income they receive or elect to receive from a beneficiary pension are currently taxable at their marginal rate, and that will be the same if these proposed changes come to force from the 6th of April 2024. The pros still remain that any funds that stay within the pension, so aren't drawn as income, benefit from the tax-free growth environment and continue to be outside of the estate for inheritance tax. Annuity income, so that final column, again, under current rules, if the individual passes away after age 75, it is taxable in the hands of the beneficiary, and there's no proposed changes to that either. So broadly, in summary, if we take these two slides together, should the individual pass away after age 75, there isn't any significant change to the position under the current rules and from the 6th of April next year. It's death prior to age 75, whereas there is the potential key change. Crucially as well, the key aspect that we are considering is what that means for individuals that are currently receiving beneficiary pension income, having already elected for a beneficiary pension and their spouse passed away pre-age 75. So currently they are receiving tax-free pension payments from a beneficiary pension. There is the potential, and that's our big caveat, that these could become taxable from the 6th of April 2024. Just get Jordan to go on to what I think is the last summary, absolutely, which summarises these headlines. So all pension income will potentially become taxable for the beneficiaries pre or post 75. So it is only that lump sum option that remains the tax-free element. This potentially means that beneficiary pensions will be less attractive and lump sums more attractive, but we must consider that in the round and as part of the beneficiary's overall financial planning, because it does have significant income tax, capital gains tax and inheritance tax consequences as well. So it is really important that any decision that is taken, you seek advice and it's on a bespoke basis, because the right solution will be different for different individuals and for different families as well. Lump sums paid on death, so pre-age 75, will be limited to the new lump sum and death benefit allowance. I'm not going to try and say that acronym quickly, which is set at the higher of the previous lifetime allowance, which is the 1,073,100, or if an individual has a protected lifetime allowance, so as Nick referred to, fixed protection, individual protection, or enhanced protection as well. Anything that exceeds that allowance will be subject to income tax for the beneficiary. And this combines lump sums payable in life, so what we refer to as tax-free cash, and lump sums payable on death as well. So as I said previously, it has made advisors like myself and Nick revisit death benefits and the position on death for our clients with quite some interest to make sure that we're ready for any potential changes from the 6th of April next year. Death post 75, thank you, Jordan, is seemingly unchanged. She says seemingly. We will, of course, monitor this very carefully, and it's likely that any benefits taken from the pension will be taxed at the beneficiary's marginal rate of income tax. And I'm now going to just hand back to Nick to summarise and give our house view.
Thanks, Laura, and well done. I think given how uncertain and complex it is, I think you did a great job there. So thanks for that. So yeah, just to wrap up the session and try and consolidate all of this information into some general house views. I think there's a temptation, and I probably will use the cliche of the devil's in the detail here, and you can probably sense by mine and Laura's sort of nervousness and sort of constant referring to making sure we get legislation out of draft form and getting some clarity on some points. So I think that's my overriding feeling at the moment is that there's still a lot of information that we're not clear on. Some of it feels very crucial to our clients. But generally, if we go back to, as I was sort of talking about earlier, go back to the start of this year and reflect on what's changed for the positive and what's changed for the negative. Well, on the positive front, people can now contribute more. A lot of people can now contribute when they thought they would never contribute again, even if at relatively small levels. That's a positive thing for clients, and we've sort of really been opening up those conversations around recontributing, considering company contributions as well for certain people, especially those over 75. So definitely some more planning angles introduced from that. The surprise abolition of the lifetime allowance has saved some people tens, if not hundreds of thousands of pounds of tax. I'm sure there's people out there who would save millions of pounds of tax for. So that's a positive ultimately. As we've talked about, there will be for some people a nice little surprise towards the end of this year, hopefully with confirmation around this new lump sum allowance and actually being able to access some pensions and get some tax-free cash out of them. We've still got all of the sort of things we've been worried about historically. So we're still getting marginal rate income tax relief on contributions. That's been long talked about as going, but for me, I think it's too difficult to make that change to the tax system. We've still got tax-free cash, which is another one that comes up in the papers every February and March as the budgets come round. The IHT position of pensions is unchanged. So most IHT, most pensions, not all, as Laura said, will fall outside of the scope of inheritance tax. And ultimately, we've still got this 2-year window post-death to make sure pensions are administered. And that's an important one on two counts. One, some people's estates do rumble on and they miss this deadline and it has fairly significant impacts. But also, if you've got any family members or friends or clients who are in a position where somebody's passed away and there's a pension fund to be passed on, it could be very crucial to make sure that happens possibly prior to, possibly post the 6th of April 2023, depending on the outcome. So if there are those pension funds in the process of administration, then just be very careful around that over the next 6 months or so. On the negative side, it pretty much all falls into the camp of the death benefit rules pre-age 75. And let's be positive, most of us die, touch wood, over the age of 75. So actually, whilst there will be a need for everybody to go and cover that position and have a plan for if something happens before age 75, actually for most people, the changes affect only the scenario where death occurs pre-age 75. So I think on balance, these are positive changes. They bring more complexity to an area that does not need any more complexity. But aside from that, I think there's some real positives in here. And most people should go and look at their pension position again, as I said at the start, and look at which elements of these areas impact them. So just to come to a bit of a planning opportunities and necessities slide to finish off. I'll rattle through this quickly because I've got a couple of questions. As we've said already, around the contribution annual allowance point, think around, have these changes impacted what I can or what I might do in relation to contributions? Can I contribute more because the overall annual allowance is higher? Is my tapered AA position different? Is my money purchase annual allowance position different? Or have I previously stopped because I had lifetime allowance protection, but now I can contribute again, safe in the knowledge that it won't nullify my LTA protection? The lifetime allowance position, I think the main points around that are this phantom crystallization idea for those people who've got excess funds above the outgoing lifetime allowance, and just thinking about whether you want to try and protect your position in case of legislative rowback. And then a key point around the new lump sum rules and whether you should, well, whether hopefully you can access some more tax-free cash. Not many will, so not to get too many hopes up. But for those people who had sort of significant defined benefit pensions, it could be relevant. And then, as Laura mentioned, just make sure you're really careful around reviewing the death benefit rules. We would have said anyway, most people should at least consider widening their beneficiary nomination from a spouse, typically. So that's sort of still true, probably more so now. And equally, we're probably going into a regime where we should consider potentially using trusts as potential beneficiaries of pension funds. But we'll cover that in a bit more detail in future webinars. And I think more so than ever, there'll be a point where you need to review this as you approach age 75. I very much expect people will have a strategy for before age 75 and a different strategy for post age 75. So just being aware of that. And then lastly, we've said it at least once, maybe twice already, but anybody that has got an existing inherited beneficiary pension, watch the developments over the next 6 months. There's a big risk that they could all of a sudden become taxable. I hope it won't be the case, but I've certainly got a few clients who've inherited pensions from spouses and parents. And the way the draft legislation is worded, it suggests they will go from being tax-free to taxable overnight on the 6th of April. So some careful planning to consider around there potentially. So I think that is the end of the presentation, and we'll probably now just move on to the Q&A. I see we've got 3 questions at the moment and about 12 minutes to get through them, so we've probably got scope for a few more if anybody has any questions. Just going to there we go. Great question to start off with. So what does a phantom crystallization look like in practice? Do you want me to take this one, Laura, or do you want to pick this one up?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer this one. So I've actually been having a conversation with a pension provider over the last week about practically what this looks like if we try and undertake this for a client. And in essence, depending on what the individual wants to do, it can be a purely academic exercise that happens within the pension, or it can be a point at which funds are withdrawn from the pension. So and I'll use a client example that we've just done over this last week or so. This client she used 100% of her lifetime allowance, but she had a small amount that was deemed in excess of the lifetime allowance. So we had left, as Nick said, we had left to be considered at future events. What we've done is we've moved that crystallized pot, the uncrystallized pot, into a crystallized pot. So the pension scheme registers that as having been tested against a lifetime allowance. Had we been in the previous tax year, that would have been subject to a tax charge. But at the moment, it was subject to a tax charge, but the rate of tax was at 0%. She, because of personal circumstances, elected to draw that excess out as a taxable income payment. But she could also have elected to simply keep the funds within the pension and draw them as a taxable income sum at a later date. So depending on what you want to do with it, it could just be a purely academic exercise that's done at your pension scheme level, or it could be a point at which you do take a taxable payment from the pension as well. But it will depend on your pension provider about how they deal with it, because this is new to them. And there's a bit of confusion within some of the pension schemes about how they will actually document that internally. So please seek the support of an advisor to help you do it.
Just moving on to, if you're using carry forward, can you only carry forward up to £40,000 for the previous tax year, or do you have the option of 60? And that's a fairly simple one. You only have the annual allowance that was relevant for the year that you're dealing with. So at the moment, to try and get this right, we're in the 23-24 tax year. So you've got the 22-23, 21-22 and 2021. Have I got that right, Laura? Hopefully everybody's understood what I was trying to do, but you've got the 3 previous tax years. And for each of those 3 tax years, the relevant annual allowance is 40,000. So at the moment, you could do £180,000 as an overall carry forward contribution. But obviously, as we move forward through the tax years, that will slowly ramp up to being a total potential contribution of £240,000 a year. Another
also just to add to that point as well, if you were of course tapered in any of those years, you can only carry forward your available tapered annual allowances as well. It's a question I often get, so I thought it's just worth covering.
Absolutely right, Laura. A question here from somebody I know well. So it says, effectively, where you're a client of Mazar and phantom crystallizations may be relevant. Will we be contacting our clients about that? Absolutely, we will. I think at the moment we are still awaiting the final part of the legislation that's going to be coming into force in April 2024 to have as much visibility of all elements of the rules so we can make the right decision. So our current intention is to start to contact, well, we will have obviously had review meetings with lots of clients and talked about it, but in the absence of that, or in addition to that, we'll be contacting clients towards the end of this calendar year, so November and December, with a view to hopefully having concrete legislation in place, or at least concrete details of legislation in place by January, February, so we can make sure that any action needs to be that does need to be taken is taken effectively. So yes, rest assured that contact will be made. Obviously, if you want to touch base with your advisor, then feel free. Shall I keep reading them, Laura? Have you got them open?
Yeah.
So I have a SIP inherited as first nominee as my spouse died before the age of 75. I currently draw a monthly payment tax-free. It sounds as if from the 6th of April 2024, the monthly payments will be subject to income tax. I think that's where the devil's in the detail, really. We're hoping not. It is the answer. And it would feel, to me, unfair and against the way legislation is usually brought in. But the way that the draft legislation is drafted at the moment, it does suggest that, doesn't it, Laura?
Yes, yeah. At the moment, there is the potential for that to be how it's interpreted, but we, of course, as Nick said, want to see the real detail.
Thank you for all these questions. I think there is one more. So I think they are, well, there's 2 questions, but I think they're from the same person asking the same thing. So it questions whether, with the removal of the lifetime allowance and the 55% tax charge, I'm trying to explain this for everybody. So previously, where you took excess funds out of a pension fund as a lump sum that were over the lifetime allowance, there was the 55% tax rate that we talked about earlier. And this person is posing the question of whether, if with the absence of the lifetime allowance and those tax rates, they were to draw the excess funds as an income from next year onwards, then effectively could they be in a worse rate because of the personal allowance trap that exists above, between £100,000 and £125,000? The answer is yes. I think from an advisor's perspective, and I'm sure Laura will agree with this, we would do everything we could to avoid a client taking pension income that sits in that 100 to 125,000 bracket when you're suffering 60% income tax because of the loss of the personal allowance. It means you're giving up almost all of the fund and you're seeing very little benefit from it. So whilst you're absolutely right to make that observation, I think you ultimately just wouldn't take the income unless it was desperately needed. But in that situation, you'd probably look to do some form of crystallisation this year while the tax rate 0% would be my view.
Yeah, absolutely.
As our resident phantom crystallisation expert, Laura, as you've become, do you want to take the... I also have a small SIP with another provider. Would they understand what is meant by a phantom crystallisation? Is it an industry term?
I think it's an industry term that's developed very rapidly over the last few months. They should understand what a crystallisation event means, but I would always encourage you to ask an advisor to support you with it, because we will be able to ask the specific questions that we want to make sure that it's appropriate for you, and that we're completing the appropriate documents with that provider.
And what I would say there is, if you have it might not be correct, but if you have a small SIP with somebody else, it might be that you have a defined benefit pension that's used up a lot of your lifetime allowance. In that scenario, it's a question of whether a phantom crystallisation this year is the right thing for you, or whether you should leave the pension uncrystallised till next year, when you might well be able to access 25% of that fund tax-free. So again, take advice would be my suggestion. As small as it may be, it's probably worth having a conversation. And then the last one just wraps things up nicely, I think, because somebody asking to send a copy of the slides. So as I mentioned at the very beginning, we will be sending out a copy of this recording, which will have the slides with it and all of the house views and everything. That will be coming out potentially later today, but certainly before the end of the week. Please feel free to get in touch with me, Laura, or your usual point of contact at Mazar, and we'll be happy to assist you moving forwards. And equally, if there's anybody you feel would benefit from the slides, then obviously please feel free to send them on. But I hope, well, just to wrap up, I hope that's been a useful recap for everybody. As I've said a few times, we're expecting some more legislation or legislative updates over the coming months, and we plan to run our next webinar on the 10th of January, and that we hope will be a more concrete, these are the rules we are expecting, this is therefore what we think people should be thinking about. We'll try and give a few more client examples in there so people can pick out the bits that are relevant to them. Again, though, if there's any questions or anybody who just wants to have a discussion in the meantime, then please do get in touch. Otherwise, I hope you have a good rest of the day.